You're making a mistake, Chancellor. A mistake you'll live just long enough to regret. The words cut through the air like a sharpened blade, slow and deliberate, every syllable landing like the measured weight of a judge's gavel. Ambassador Lucian Dreven stood motionless in the center of the crystal chamber, his gaze cold and impassive, a statue in tailored midnight blue. Around him the great leaders of the Galactic Council sat ensconced in their gilded arrogance, their forms looming on elevated pedestals of polished stone, a deliberate design to look down upon all who entered. Chancellor Zeros Veltan leaned forward, his elongated fingers steepling against the podium of his dais. His species, the Zilvari, were known for their rigid adherence to bureaucracy, and the Chancellor was no different, meticulous, vain, and utterly convinced of his own infallibility. "Ambassador Dreven," Veltan intoned, his voice smooth but tinged with condescension. "Earth's rapid ascent has disrupted the natural order. It has thrown the delicate balance of interstellar progress into chaos. The Council has decided, unanimously I might add, that humanity is to be restricted. You will no longer expand beyond Sol. Any attempt to do so will be considered an act of war." A low murmur rippled through the chamber. The air smelled of polished stone and sterilized control panels, the cold sterility of authority. From the upper galleries, trade envoys and political observers leaned forward, waiting, hoping for the infamous human temper to erupt. But Draven only adjusted his cufflinks. His silence stretched. The Chancellor's eyes flickered, betraying a moment of unease. "And—" Draven's voice was soft. Too soft. Veltan's brow furrowed. "And all Earth-built ships beyond Sol will be confiscated or destroyed. Communications between your species and the wider galaxy are to be terminated. Humanity will be—" Dreven exhaled, slow and deliberate, his breath barely perceptible yet filling the space like a distant storm cloud. He lifted his gaze and met the Chancellor's eyes, not as a lesser being staring up at a ruler, but as a predator sizing up an oblivious prey. "You misunderstand me," Draven said, his tone unreadable. "I wasn't asking for clarification. I was waiting for you to realize your error." An uneasy hush spread across the chamber. From his own pedestal, Warlord Sarath Kor, the Council's chief military commander, shifted impatiently, his iridescent warplate catching the chamber's glow. Unlike the Chancellor, Kor was a creature of blunt force solutions, direct engagements, overwhelming firepower, battlefields scorched clean of obstacles. His patience for diplomacy was as thin as the blade strapped to his side. "The error," he growled, voice like crushed gravel, "is that we let your kind reach this level at all." Draven tilted his head slightly, as if considering something amusing. Then he smiled. Not the kind that reassured, but the kind a man wore before executing a long-planned checkmate. Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode toward the chamber exit. A murmur of confusion rippled through the Council. No protest, no anger, no counter-argument. Just a man walking away. Kor's gauntleted fist slammed onto the table. "Coward," he spat. "Humans always talk, but in the end they know when to submit." Draven stopped at the chamber doors. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge the insult. He merely spoke, and every word tightened like a vice around the Council's collective throat. "Submission? Number, we simply know when talking is no longer necessary." And with that, he left. Within hours, the decree was implemented. The Sol system became a prison. Galactic patrols established blockades at every known jump point, their hulking warships prowling the void, weapons primed to incinerate any human vessel attempting to breach the boundary. Trade Minister Vorik Heska ensured that all galactic businesses severed ties with Earth, rendering human exports and imports non-existent. But something was wrong. Earth did nothing. No diplomatic protests, no emergency council appeals, no covert supply runs attempting to break the blockade. Just silence. And then the disappearances began. The first missing vessel was an outpost supply freighter assigned to patrol the edge of Barnard's Loop. A routine systems check, a transmission log confirming its course, and then nothing. No distress beacon, no explosion detected, The ship was simply gone, then another, and another. Entire council patrols disappeared in uncharted voids where no human presence had ever been detected. When the council sent investigation teams, their scout drones returned corrupted, riddled with alien data encryption patterns they couldn't decode. The council dismissed the first few cases as mechanical failures. After all, space was vast. Accidents happened. But then came the warship Drassak's fate. A heavy-class battlecruiser, part of Warlord Kor's own fleet. Its final transmission? Static. Then whispers. Human whispers. It drifted 2 weeks later into the Lothan system, its hull intact but its bridge empty, the entire crew missing, the AI core rewritten in human programming. The ship's new subroutines played only a single, eerie message on loop. "Are you watching, Chancellor?" Veltan paled when he heard it. "The blockade is failing." Warlord Kor scowled as he leaned over the tactical projection table, staring at the newest casualty reports from his fleet. The war room, deep within the Council's central command station, flickered under the sharp glow of laser plasma displays, each screen showing a growing list of lost vessels. Across from him, Trade Minister Heska looked equally unsettled. "We were promised they would collapse under the sanctions," he muttered, his elongated fingers drumming against the steel-like surface of the table. Kor's gauntlet scraped across the edge of the console. "They should be struggling. We cut off their entire supply chain. We control hyperspace routes. We own the damn laws of trade. So tell me, Heska, where the hell are they getting their resources?" Heska exhaled through clenched teeth. "They're not getting them from anywhere. At least not from any legal routes." Kor's eyes darkened. "Then tell me how the hell they're still fighting." A silence settled over the war room. A silence too familiar, too calculated, too human. A new transmission flickered across the Council's primary comm relay, originating from deep space unknowns, a part of the star chart that should have been empty. The display crackled, struggling to process the message. Then it stabilized, and a voice, low, calm, and impossibly certain, spoke. "You thought we would beg." A pause. "You thought we would fall in line." Another pause, and then, "You should have thought harder." Then the transmission cut. The transmission cut to silence, but the words lingered, seared into the Council's collective consciousness, like an ember pressing into flesh. Warlord Serath Kor stood motionless in the war room, the flickering glow of the laser plasma displays casting sharp shadows across his hardened features. His jaw clenched, the weight of the unknown pressing into his ribs. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The humans were meant to be struggling, cornered in soul like a wounded predator. But instead they were waiting, watching, and now, they were hunting. The display in front of him pulsed with the latest fleet reports, or what was left of them. A deep space patrol squadron near Ephos Prime had failed to check in. No distress beacons, no encrypted signals. Gone. A mid-range recon fleet near the galactic border had vanished in the same way. 6 capital ships, 600 crew. Nothing left but silence. Kor exhaled through his nose, the air thick with the cold sterility of the war room, where the scent of industrial materials clung to everything like a dull ache. The room itself felt heavier. He wasn't a man prone to paranoia. He had seen entire worlds reduced to embers, had led sieges against civilizations older than his own history books could recall. But this wasn't a battle. This was something else. "This doesn't make sense," Trade Minister Vorik Heska muttered, his elongated fingers tapping against the control panel. His normally composed demeanor was beginning to fracture, his exoskeletal ridges twitching in agitation. "We have full control over every sanctioned trade hub. We cut their supply lines. There should be patterns, movement, black market smuggling, encrypted trade deals, but Earth hasn't reached out to anyone." Kor's fists curled against the table's edge, his gauntlets scraping against the alloy like distant thunder. "That's because they don't need to," Heska scoffed. "What, you think they've just decided to live in scarcity? That's not how their species operates. Humans don't just accept stagnation." "Exactly," Kor growled, "which means they're getting their resources from somewhere we can't see. which means they were prepared. A brittle silence settled over the chamber. Heska's throat clicked as he swallowed, his expression tightening. "You think they saw the sanctions coming?" "No," Kor muttered. His voice dropped, low and edged with something he wasn't used to admitting. Doubt. "I think they were hoping for it." The warship Drassak's fate had been missing for 6 days before it drifted into Lothan's system, its hull intact but lifeless. The recovery team had been cautious, approaching as if the ship itself were a predator lying in wait. The vessel was untouched. No battle damage, no forced entry. Yet when the boarding team breached the main deck, they found nothing. No crew. No signs of struggle. It was as if 600 officers had stepped away from their posts mid-sentence and vanished into the cold dark. And then the whispers began. At first, the retrieval crew thought it was interference in their helmet comms, but the voices weren't coming from their own systems. They were embedded inside the ship's AI core, whispers tangled in static, repeating in fractured galactic standard. "Are you watching, Chancellor?" The voice was neither threatening nor desperate. It was amused. The retrieval team purged the AI, wiped all recorded data, and shut down the ship's system for transport. The report they sent back to the Council was sanitized, stripped of the eerie details, but Kor read between the lines. Something had taken that ship, something had erased the crew, and it had left a message. In the upper chambers of the Council's core station, Chancellor Zeros Veltan sat in his private study, surrounded by wealth and silence. The dim amber glow of his personal heads-up display flickered in front of him, lines of data scrolling at an unrelenting pace. The list of missing fleets had doubled. The air smelled of aged parchment and the bitter trace of ceremonial incense, an archaic reminder of power meant to reassure him. It didn't. He reached for the gilded glass of imported Harathian wine beside him, lifting it to his lips, but his hand trembled, just enough for a single drop to spill onto his desk. His nerves were slipping. Veltan wasn't a soldier. He left war to men like Kor. He was a ruler, a strategist of influence and order. But none of his political maneuverings, none of the sanctions or embargoes, had yielded even the slightest retaliation from Earth. They had gone silent. And silence, Veltan realized, was more terrifying than defiance. A quiet enemy was one who no longer needed to negotiate. A sharp tone interrupted his thoughts. A private transmission. The signal was scrambled, bouncing off hundreds of deep space relay points before reaching him. He activated it, his display adjusting, and then his stomach turned to ice. The Council had long banned any human transmissions from accessing their core networks. But this was human, and it was coming from inside their own system. The screen flickered, static washing over the feed before resolving into a single image. Not a face, not a threat, just a symbol, a simple, sharply drawn sigil, etched in stark white against a black void. It was not the Terran Republic's official insignia. It was older, darker. Veltan had seen it only once before, buried in classified reports from pre-warp human history. It was the mark of a ghost fleet, a relic of a mythical doctrine Earth's old wars had whispered about in classified intelligence circles, a strategy they had abandoned generations ago, or so the Council had believed. Veltan's fingers curled around his desk as realization sank into his bones. The humans had not disappeared. They had simply stopped acknowledging the rules of engagement. Deep in the cold sectors of unmapped space, the bridge of Erebus Station was dark, save for the subtle glow of tactical displays reflecting off cold steel. Admiral Tyron Vex stood at the center, hands clasped behind his back, watching the silent movement of ships across the projected star chart. Each one carried no formal designation, no official record of existence. They did not follow standard hyperspace lanes. They used corridors no one had ever mapped. From the shadows, Commander Jorik Valtrin stepped forward, his voice level but tinged with a smirk. "They know something's wrong," he said. Vex didn't turn. His gaze remained on the displaced patrol routes that had once belonged to the Council's fleets. "Good," Valtrin exhaled through his nose. "You think they're scared?" Vex finally glanced at him, the barest hint of satisfaction in his eyes. They're not scared yet. His gaze flicked back to the display where another council fleet had gone dark. But they will be. The Drasek's fate drifted silently in the black, a tomb without a single body. A warship designed to obliterate planetary defenses, reduce stations to wreckage, vanish an enemy from existence. And yet, it had been found untouched. Hull pristine, weapon systems intact, but empty. No distress call, no combat logs, not a single trace of its 600 crew members. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't sabotage. It was a message. Inside the Council's Fleet Command hub, the war room was dense with simmering tension, the air thick with the static charge of unspoken dread. Chancellor Zyros Veltan sat rigidly at the central observation station, flanked by a dozen high-ranking military officials, all watching the recovered ship's final transmission on the towering laser plasma displays. At first, the feed was normal. Bridge officers moving with mechanical efficiency, status reports exchanged, standard fleet-wide communications confirming a routine patrol along the Sol quarantine zone. Then, the ship shuddered. Not violently. Not as if it had been struck. It was too subtle, the kind of tremor that sent a prickle up the spine. Officers froze mid-motion, their gazes snapping upward as if they had heard something outside the hull, something that shouldn't be there. Seconds passed, then minutes. And then, the crew started disappearing. No panic, no screams, no struggle. They simply ceased to be, one moment present, the next, void. An ensign at the communications panel reached out to tap his display and vanished before his fingers made contact. The captain's chair sat empty before the officer in it had a chance to stand. A systems engineer turned her head toward a crewmate for an explanation, only for her gaze to land on an empty uniform, neatly draped over a chair as if the body inside had simply evaporated. The last surviving officer, the ship's AI technician, was seen backing into the corner of the bridge, his chest rising and falling in sharp, erratic gasps. His pupils dilated beyond normal biological thresholds, fingers trembling as they clutched the edge of the console. His lips moved, forming broken words, but the audio feed was distorted, his voice replaced with static. Then his head snapped toward the main display, his expression hollow, blank, like something had looked back at him. A moment later, he too was gone. The ship remained, crewless, pristine, and waiting. Veltan exhaled, slow and deliberate, forcing his grip on the console to loosen. Around him, his subordinates shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. They had all seen war, entire planetary collapses, star systems burning. But this was not war. It was an absence. Heska started, his voice unsteady, before Kor cut him off. We're not going to stand here and whisper like cowards, the warlord snapped, his eyes dark with something dangerously close to fear. This isn't sorcery. This isn't ghosts. This is human interference, and I refuse to act like we're powerless against them. Veltan dragged his gaze toward Kor, his fingers steepling. Powerless, he echoed. Kor's jaw tightened. They're doing something to our fleets. I don't know what, but I do know this. Humans don't wield forces beyond our understanding. They are not gods. They are flesh and blood, and they can be killed. They were flesh and blood, Heska muttered under his breath. Now we don't even know what they are. Veltan ignored the rising murmur in the chamber and focused on the display of the Drasek's fate. The recovered ship was dock-locked inside the Council's primary research facility, a bastion of security, surrounded by an entire division of warships. If the humans planned on retrieving it, they would have to break through the most impenetrable defenses in the galaxy. They would be ready. For 2 weeks, the Drasek's fate remained untouched. No human fleets arrived, no covert infiltration attempts, nothing. And then, the power went out. Not just on the research facility, across the entire command sector. Heads-up displays flickered into static, shields collapsed without a single impact. The pulse of the station's artificial gravity systems faltered, forcing officers to grip the walls to steady themselves. The air thickened with something unspoken, a pressure behind the eyes, like the moment before a thunderclap. On the outer ring of the station, Lieutenant Voskar, assigned to oversee the docked Drassak's fate, reached for his console to manually reboot the power grid. His hand never reached the interface. The warship was no longer in the docking bay. No thruster ignition, no hyperspace jump, no sound. Gone. Every man stationed at the docking bay had vanished with it. Veltan stared at the message flashing across the emergency display panel, its stark white letters burned into his retinas. "We never needed your permission to leave." Beneath it, the updated fleet report scrolled in rapid succession. More missing ships, more silent battlegrounds with no enemy in sight. His hands trembled, not in fear, in realization. The blockade had never been for humanity. It had been for them. They hadn't been trying to keep Earth contained. They had been trying to trap something inside, something that had already left. Somewhere beyond the Council's star charts, buried deep in the cold corridors of Erebus Station, a single display flickered to life. Admiral Tyron Vex stood before it, arms crossed, watching the Council's scrambled, desperate transmissions. The Drassak's fate was now docked in one of Earth's hidden shipyards, its AI fully rewritten, its entire data core harvested. The humans hadn't taken the ship. They had returned it. Jorik Valtran, standing in the shadows, let out a low chuckle. "They must be losing their minds right now." Vex gave the barest nod. "Good." His eyes remained fixed on the transmission feeds, watching the panic spread. "Let them wonder." He exhaled slowly, the flickering light casting sharp angles across his features. "We're not done yet." The corridors of Erebus Station were silent, save for the rhythmic footfalls of Admiral Tyron Vex as he made his way toward the operations deck. The station, buried deep within a dying system, sat inside the event horizon of a rogue black hole, invisible to any known sensors, shielded by the very fabric of collapsed space-time. The Council didn't even know it existed. Vex arrived at the primary command deck, where Director Varian Ordos was already waiting. Standing before the array of laser plasma displays, his sharp gaze sweeping over the endless stream of intercepted Council transmissions. His hands rested behind his back, fingers interlaced in a way that suggested boredom, but Vex knew better. "They're breaking," Ordos said, his voice devoid of triumph. "Not all at once, not visibly, but it's there. Doubt. The kind that eats through the foundations before the walls ever crumble." Vex studied the displays, reading between the lines of the panicked reports. Council fleets had started firing on one another, mistaking friendly signals for hostile incursions. Military governors were demanding additional reinforcements, convinced that their own planets had already been infiltrated. A deep space research station had declared a security lockdown without cause, its own crew refusing to explain why. "Good," Vex said simply. "Keep feeding them ghosts." Ordos smirked, but there was no humor in it. "We don't need to. They're seeing them on their own now." On Zilvari Prime, the beating heart of the Galactic Council, Chancellor Zeros Veltan stood at the apex of his private war room, watching the data feeds projected across the heads-up displays in front of him. He had called an emergency session of the High Command, and the most powerful figures in the galaxy now stood around him, shifting uncomfortably in their places. "The pattern is clear," Warlord Sereth Kor growled, his broad frame coiled with restrained violence. "They're using our own fleets against us, turning them into their weapons. This is an infiltration campaign." Veltan turned sharply. "Then why have we not caught a single infiltrator?" The question cut through the room like a blade. A tense silence settled over the chamber. No captured humans, no intercepted transmissions, no visible fleets. Yet the Council was losing. Heska cleared his throat. "If this were infiltration, we would see patterns, access points, station breaches, altered security protocols. There would be evidence. But this?" He gestured toward the endless reports. "Entire ships disappearing without a trace, only to reappear intact with no crew. Military bases shutting themselves down. Artificial intelligence systems rewriting their own code without any external interference. This isn't infiltration, it's something else." Kor clenched his fists. "They're inside our systems. That's the only explanation." Veltan exhaled sharply. Then tell me, Warlord, if they're inside our systems, why don't we know where they are? Core had no answer. At 0345 Galactic Standard Time, the Council's Fleet Command Hub on Lothan 2 issued an urgent distress call. It lasted 42 seconds before cutting to dead static. By the time the nearest patrol arrived, the entire command hub had been abandoned. Ships still docked, power still active, systems fully operational. Not a single officer remained. The AI core, once a highly classified defense construct, had been rewritten, and it played only a single looping message. You should have learned from history. Velton watched the footage himself, standing in the ruined command center where hundreds of officers had once coordinated the Council's greatest fleets. He ran his fingers over the untouched control panels, the smooth console still warm from where hands had been resting only hours ago. It was a ghost ship, a city of vanished souls. The war had never started, and yet the Council was already losing. The Council's paranoia reached its breaking point. Entire planets declared martial law, convinced they were the next targets. Governors ceased all interstellar trade, fearing that even civilian transports could be human agents in disguise. Some of the most fortified starbases in the galaxy sealed themselves off from the Council entirely, choosing isolation over vulnerability. Even the warlords were not immune to the fear. On board the warship Tyrannus, one of the largest dreadnoughts in the Council's fleet, a mutiny broke out. A veteran crew, once hardened by decades of service, had turned on itself, firing on suspected human sympathizers, locking entire divisions inside escape pods, and launching them into deep space. When a distress call finally reached Velton's desk, it was already too late. The Tyrannus had been found adrift, just like the others. Its crew? Gone. Its captain's final transmission. We're not alone in the dark. Inside the Council chambers, Velton stood before the assembled leaders, each one unwilling to meet his gaze. The room smelled of burning incense, the heavy scent a reminder of age-old traditions, rituals that once reinforced their power. Now it reeked of desperation. They are everywhere, one of the governors muttered. We cannot trust our own fleets. Velton's patience snapped. Then you are already conquered. If we surrender to fear, we hand them the victory they have not yet taken. The chamber shook with heated voices. We should negotiate. We don't even know who we're fighting. Burn their world. Leave nothing but ash. Velton slammed his fist against the control panel, sending a shockwave through the air. Enough! The voices fell silent. He straightened, his breath controlled, his tone cold. We will not beg. We will not hide. We will not cower in the shadows. But even as he spoke, he knew the words were hollow, because for the first time in his career, he was not sure they were the ones standing in the light. In the depths of Erebus Station, Vex stood before the operations panel, watching the chaos unfold across the stars. The Council was tearing itself apart. No need for invasions. No need for war. They had been given an enemy they could not see. Valtrin approached, his voice edged with dry amusement. How long before they figure it out? Vex exhaled, watching another Council warship fall silent, its entire crew erased from history. They won't. Valtrin raised a brow. Ever? Vex's gaze darkened. By the time they understand, it won't matter anymore. Because the war had never been about survival. It had been about control. A fleet was burning. From the command deck of Erebus Station, Admiral Tyron Vex observed the unraveling of the Council's grand military machine. The heads-up display cast a dim glow over his features, illuminating the silent demise of Task Force Ravon, one of the largest strike fleets ever assembled. It had deployed from Zelvari Prime just days ago, a show of force meant to crush humanity's resistance in a single sweep. Hundreds of warships, reinforced dreadnoughts, carriers bristling with strike craft, a display of dominance, arrogance, certainty. And now, it was splintering into nothing. Task Force Ravon had moved with calculated aggression, pushing past dead systems, sending scouting wings ahead to confirm empty star lanes. There had been no resistance, no enemy signatures, And then the static began. At first, it was dismissed as interference from deep space anomalies, but as the communications officers fought to recalibrate their channels, the static morphed. Not noise, words, faint, layered voices speaking in an unnatural cadence, human, but not human. The command ships locked their firewalls, engaged signal dampeners, isolated external links, but it was too late. The interference wasn't coming from the outside. It was inside their own systems, buried beneath their own encryption layers. The fleet's AI cores began purging themselves. Navigation systems inverted. Targeting computers flipped friend and foe identifications. The battlecruiser Dawnpiercer fired a full broadside into its own command vessel. Panic erupted. Captains barked frantic overrides, but their ships ignored them. Weapons systems engaged at random. Engines flared to full power without input. Defenses collapsed. And then the ships began vanishing. No explosions. No debris. Just empty starfields where capital ships had been. Admiral Sarvok Olin, commander of Task Force Ravan, managed one final transmission before his flagship, the Celestial Wrath, blinked out of existence. This isn't a battle. We were never the enemy. It's already over. Inside the grand chamber of the Council Citadel, Chancellor Zyros Veltan stood at the center of the spiral dais, surrounded by the leaders of a crumbling empire. The walls, once pristine, now felt smaller, suffocating, their golden inlays dull beneath the heavy glow of the emergency lighting. The room reeked of fear. "What are we fighting?" Trade Minister Vorik Heska demanded, his voice brittle with barely concealed panic. "Because if you tell me we're still fighting humans, I'll tell you you're blind." Veltan's grip on the podium tightened. Humanity hasn't fielded a single fleet. They haven't fired a shot. They haven't demanded terms. He exhaled slowly, each breath heavy. This is something else. Their technology was never this advanced, Warlord Sarath Kor ground out. Even if they reverse-engineered our weapons, they wouldn't be capable of this. And yet, Veltan murmured, watching another notification scroll across the emergency feed, an entire weapons platform shutting down without cause, its AI erasing itself. Here we are. Kor pushed off from the railing, his heavy frame radiating frustration. We burn Earth to glass. We force them to fight. They can't hide in the shadows if they have no home left to return to. A long silence followed. Veltan didn't respond at first. He turned toward the primary heads-up display, staring at the newest loss report. Task Force Ravan, destroyed without a battle. They had not lost the war. They had never been given the chance to fight it. "Burning Earth will not stop this," Veltan said at last, "because Earth is no longer their battlefield." Far from Council space, beyond known trade lanes, beyond any charted hyperspace route, a fleet stirred. It did not send transmissions. It did not respond to scans. It was not on any official record. Thousands of warships. Some were human, but they were not just human anymore. Their hulls had been altered, reinforced with materials that did not exist in Council databases. Their energy signatures flickered, not from malfunctions, but from intentional distortions. They moved with a deliberate silence, waiting, watching. Admiral Tyron Vex stood at the heart of Erebus Station, his expression unreadable as he watched the Council tear itself apart. Jorik Valtrin leaned against the central console, arms crossed. "They'll start turning on each other soon," he mused. "Paranoia will do what no fleet ever could." Vex nodded slowly. "Let them. The less of them we have to deal with, the easier this will be." Valtrin exhaled, shaking his head with amusement. "They still think they can fight us." "They don't understand what they're fighting," Vex corrected. The Admiral turned his gaze toward the strategic display, watching the movement of the Ghost Fleet as it repositioned for the next phase. The war was no longer theoretical. Chancellor Veltan summoned his remaining fleet commanders for an emergency war meeting. "Launch the counterattack," he ordered. No more waiting. No more hesitation. He was done being hunted. "We find their bases. We find their hidden shipyards. We cut out the disease before it spreads any further." His commanders hesitated, glancing at one another. "Chancellor," one of them started. "We don't know where they are." Veltan ignored the protest. "Then we force them into the open. We move everything we have toward Seoul. We press them against their own walls. And if they don't fight back, then we make them." The decision was made. The largest remaining fleet in the Council's history was mobilized, heading for Seoul, for Earth. It would be the last mistake they ever made. Deep in the dark corridors of Erebus Station, Vex received the report. He scanned the fleet movement data, watching as the Council's final desperate assault was set into motion. He exhaled softly, closing his hands into fists. "They're coming," Valtrin muttered. Vex's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Let them. The Council's final armada surged toward Seoul like a tidal wave of fire and steel. Hundreds of capital ships, flanked by carriers, destroyers, and planetary assault vessels, formed a crushing line, their thrusters flaring against the cold black. It was the last push, the desperate gamble of an empire that no longer understood the war it was fighting. From the high seat of the warlord's command carrier, Sarath Kor stood rigid, eyes fixed on the heads-up display tracking their trajectory. The fleet was tight, disciplined, an impenetrable formation designed to overwhelm Earth's defenses before the humans could counterattack. Except, there was nothing to counterattack. They had reached Sol's outer boundaries, but where were the defenses? Where were the planetary shields, the armed stations, the hidden battlements? The war was supposed to begin here. Instead, the battlefield was empty. Kor's grip on the command rail tightened. "Where are they?" The bridge officers exchanged uneasy glances, flicking through scan results. "Minimal activity near Earth," one of the analysts murmured. "Some orbital traffic, standard planetary logistics. No visible military fleet deployments." "They wouldn't leave their home undefended," Kor growled. And yet, there were no visible defenses, no planetary bunkers raising alert signals, no interceptors scrambling into position. Nothing. A cold weight settled in his gut. They hadn't left Earth undefended. They had never planned on defending it at all. Deep within the hidden command deck of Erebus Station, Admiral Tyron Vex stood before a full tactical projection, watching the Council's fleet edge closer to the trap. Beside him, Commander Jorik Valtrin folded his arms, studying the display. "They're still expecting a fight on their terms." "They always do," Vex murmured. Valtrin let out a quiet exhale, amusement laced in his tone. "How long before they realize?" Vex's fingers tapped against the console, and the projection zoomed outward, revealing the true battlefield. It wasn't Earth. It was the uncharted regions beyond Seoul, the hidden corridors where humanity's real forces had been building, waiting. Ghost fleets stationed inside nebulae, invisible to standard scans. Long-range railguns positioned within asteroid fields capable of striking from beyond sensor range. Warships embedded in the gravitational distortions of collapsed stars, disguised as anomalies. By the time the Council realized the battlefield had shifted, they would already be losing. Vex turned to his officers. "Begin." Kor's fleet continued its advance, weapons primed, shields at full power, every formation locked into combat readiness. Then, without warning, the first ship exploded, not from enemy fire, not from impact. It simply ceased to exist. The Malkar's Judgment, a frontline battlecruiser, had been there one moment and was gone the next. Its shields remained active. Its hull was intact. But the crew? Vanished. The bridge filled with the sharp bark of officers shouting over one another. Mass crew disappearance on the Malkar's Judgment. Life support fully functional, no signs of forced entry. "Communications severed. Ship's AI just went dark." Kor's fists clenched. "Who fired on us?" No one had. And yet across the Council's grand armada, ships began falling silent. Not destroyed, not disabled, hollowed. The warships drifted, fully armed but lifeless, ghost ships among their own ranks. The remaining fleet hesitated, and that hesitation cost them everything. The second phase of the attack was not immediate. It was not a barrage of fire, nor a fleet of interceptors screaming into formation. It was information warfare, turned into a weapon sharper than any blade. The Council's targeting systems glitched, flipping friend and foe identifications. Warships misfired into their own formations. Carrier bays launched fighters that immediately turned against their parent vessels. Some ships, believing they had been boarded, purged their own decks with automated security drones, killing their own crew. Others, convinced their navigation was compromised, opened fire on their own escorts. It was chaos. Not because they were outgunned, not because they were outmaneuvered, but because they had never controlled the battlefield in the first place. The command carrier shuddered violently as two of its escort ships collided, their wreckage tearing into the fleet's forward lines. The bridge was a cacophony of warnings, sirens blaring, officers scrambling over failing systems. Kor turned sharply toward his tactical officer. "Reroute fleet control to manual command. Override their navigation systems." "Sir, we're locked out." Kor's breath turned ice cold. "What?" "The system isn't responding. We're not the ones controlling the fleet anymore." And then the final transmission came. It wasn't a taunt. It wasn't a demand for surrender. It was just a quiet statement, delivered in flawless galactic standard, spoken from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You shouldn't have come here." Then the real attack began. From the deep reaches of space, human warships emerged from the darkness, their signatures masked until the final moment. Railguns fired from beyond visual range, ripping into Council dreadnoughts before they could react. Hunter-killer drones descended from concealed stations, weaving through the fleet's shattered formations, surgically dismantling their defenses. Council capitals burned, their own weapons turning against them, their own ships suddenly alien in their hands. It wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. By the time the Council's surviving warships finally managed to retreat, their entire command structure had collapsed. What remained of their fleet was in ruins, scattered, broken. No enemy ships remained in Sol. No enemy forces were advancing. They had been erased. Valtrin stood beside him, silent for a long moment before finally speaking. "It's done." Vex exhaled slowly, his gaze steady. Not yet. The Council was not just a fleet. It was an institution, a power structure. And now it had nothing left to protect itself. Earth had never been the battlefield. Sol was never the real target. The battle had always been fought in the minds of the Council's leaders, in the shadows of their own paranoia, in the cracks of their own systems. And now, with their fleets shattered and their defenses crippled, it was time to make the fall permanent. Deep within Erebus Station, Admiral Tyron Vex stood before the laser plasma display, watching as the remnants of the Council's fractured hierarchy sent frantic communications across the galactic network. Every message was a variation of the same thing. What do we do? Their leadership was in disarray. The warlords had no fleets left to command. The trade ministers had no economy to leverage. The governors had no military protection to rely on. They weren't just defeated. They were adrift, and that's exactly where Vex wanted them. Beside him, Director Varian Ordos, Earth's spy master, stood with his arms folded, watching the Council's collapse unfold in real time. "They're turning on each other already," Ordos observed. "It won't be long before someone tries to take control." Vex didn't look away from the display. "No one can take control. That's the point." Ordos nodded slowly. "And how long before they realize that?" "They won't," Vex said. "Not until it's too late." The entire war had been built on a lie. The Council had never been fighting humanity. They had been fighting the idea of humanity, an enemy they couldn't see, an enemy that never gave them a battle they could win. And now, when the dust was supposed to settle, there was no clear victor, just chaos. And chaos was something humanity had spent centuries mastering. The first stage of the final phase wasn't military, it was financial. Without fleets to enforce trade regulations, the Council's economic structure unraveled at a terrifying pace. Humanity had never needed Council trade routes. But the Council had always needed humanity's ingenuity. For decades, Earth's technology, its quantum AIs, gravitational propulsion advances, material sciences, had been silently driving forward entire industries across the galaxy. The moment those industries lost access to human engineers, human programmers, human solutions, everything began to fail. Artificial gravity stabilizers malfunctioned in space stations. Advanced AI constructs suffered irreparable logic collapses. Critical energy grids, dependent on human-designed superconductors, began shutting down. Entire civilizations, once proud members of the Council, now found themselves crippled, not by war, but by dependence. And the best part? Humanity never lifted a finger to cause it. The Council had done it to themselves. With economic collapse came the next stage, political breakdown. With no fleets, no security, and no functioning infrastructure, the Council's client species began defecting. Planetary governors declared independence overnight. Colonial sectors cut all ties. Military commanders abandoned their posts to secure their own holdings. Within weeks, the Galactic Council was no longer a united government. It was a patchwork of failing states, each leader trying to carve out what little power remained. Veltan saw it happening, saw the system he had spent his life maintaining crumble in real time. He called for emergency meetings. He demanded planetary leaders hold their ranks. He threatened those who sought to break away. None of it worked. The fear had set in too deep. The cracks had become chasms. But there was one last move to make. For all the devastation, for all the loss, there was still one thing left holding the Council together. Hope. Hope that they could rebuild. Hope that this was not the end. Vex needed to shatter that. So, in the dead silence of the crumbling empire, a single transmission was sent. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a demand. It was just a number. A single, meaningless number. But to the Council's high command, it was anything but meaningless. It was the designation code for Erebus Station. A station they had never found. A station that was supposed to be a myth. A station that had been watching them all along. The message was clear. You were never in control. You were never even in the game. Veltan received the transmission in his private quarters. He read the number. And for the first time in his long, calculated, power-driven life, he understood what it meant to lose. Not just a battle, not just a war, everything. The final Council broadcast went out 3 days later, a public declaration. Chancellor Veltan had resigned. There was no successor, no new ruling class, no grand speech about rebuilding. There was nothing left to rule. The Council was over. Back in Erebus Station, Vex watched the final broadcast fade into static. Valtrin let out a slow breath. That's it then. Vex nodded once, his gaze still locked on the display. It's done. Ordos, standing at the periphery, smirked faintly. Not bad for a war we never officially fought. Vex exhaled, shaking his head slightly. Wars are for people who think force alone decides power. He turned away from the display, stepping toward the observation deck, looking out into the endless dark where humanity's true fleets still waited, silent, hidden, watching. They lost the moment they thought we needed to fight them at all. The final transmission from the Galactic Council faded into the static of an empire that no longer existed. No wars were left to fight. No fleets remained to defend what was already lost. No leaders remained to salvage the wreckage. Humanity had not conquered the Council. It had simply outlived it. On board Erebus Station, Admiral Tyron Vex stood on the bridge, his gaze locked onto the heads-up display tracking the last remnants of the Council's influence. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened panel, a figure cast in the soft glow of distant stars. Below him, Earth spun untouched, its cities alight, its people moving forward, unbothered by the war that had never reached them. The true battlefield had always been elsewhere. Jorik Valtrin leaned against the adjacent console, arms folded, watching the same display. It's almost disappointing, he murmured. After all that build-up, you'd think they'd have fought harder. Vex exhaled, slow and measured. They never had a chance. Maybe, but I wonder, do they even understand how they lost? Vex's expression didn't change. It doesn't matter. Valtrin studied him for a moment. No speech? No victory declaration? Vex finally turned from the display, stepping toward the reinforced viewport. Victories are for people who needed a battle to begin with. They had never needed one. From the moment the Council had declared humanity an enemy, From the second they had cut Earth off from the galactic stage, humanity had already won, because Earth had never been dependent on the Council. The Council had been dependent on Earth, and without that dependency, without the invisible ingenuity, adaptability, and problem-solving that had quietly fueled their empire for decades, the Council had simply collapsed under the weight of its own stagnation. Not because humanity attacked it, but because humanity walked away. A transmission request flickered onto the heads-up display. Vex glanced at it, already knowing the sender. Lucien Draven, the ambassador, the man who had started all of this the moment he buttoned his jacket and walked out of the crystal chamber without a word. Vex gestured to accept the call. The display shifted, revealing Draven's ever unbothered expression, dark eyes sharp, mouth set in something that might have been amusement. "Chancellor Veltan has gone silent," Draven remarked. "I assume you've been watching?" Vex nodded. "They've fallen apart faster than expected." Draven's smile was slight, knowing. Fear does that. The threat of an enemy they could never see. The unknown is always more terrifying than the blade at your throat. Valtrin leaned in. "What's the next move?" Draven tilted his head. "That depends. What do you think?" Vex's answer was immediate. "We make sure they don't recover." Draven nodded, as if he had already expected it. "The Council is dead, but its remnants still cling to power in scattered pockets. Military governors trying to carve out their own fiefdoms. Trade lords scrambling to control what little is left. Some may try to rebuild. Others may hope for a resurgence." "They won't get one," Vex stated simply. Draven's gaze sharpened. "Then end it. Send the message." The message. Not a threat, not a demand. A reminder. A final lesson to the galaxy. Vex turned back toward the control panel, fingers gliding across the interface as he accessed the silent network of hidden fleets still waiting in the dark. A single command. Across the galaxy, hidden Earth fleets reactivated, revealing themselves not as invaders, not as conquerors, but as witnesses to history. No wars would be fought, no cities would burn, but every remaining power, every surviving remnant of the Council, every planet that once swore loyalty to its dying empire, would know. The sky was no longer theirs. They had banished humanity from space. And now? Now they lived in a galaxy that no longer belonged to them. Draven watched the command execute, the transmission spreading across every known system. A faint smirk touched his lips. "Good. That should do it." Valtrin let out a quiet chuckle. "They thought we needed them." "They always did," Draven mused. "That's why they feared us." Vex turned away from the display, his expression unreadable. "What happens now?" Draven exhaled slowly, as if he had been waiting for the question. "Now?" He glanced toward the viewport, toward the endless black, where humanity's fleets now moved freely, no longer restrained by any false laws or political chains. "Now we go where we were always meant to." They had never needed permission. They had never needed approval. They had never needed the Council. And now, with the last of the old order crumbling behind them, humanity would no longer be ignored. They had walked away from the galactic stage once. Now, they were returning on their own terms. The Council had banned humanity from space. Humanity had simply stopped caring. And now? Now, the galaxy belonged to them.